Part, and I've got a perfect example on here about how to use planar points. I've got a couple drilled holes in locations here on this bottom. Looks like maybe there's a middle section here that's a support, and there's a support that holds the back maybe. But a couple drill locations here with some chamfered holes. But my client needs to know exactly where the center point is so that he can set up a drill jig or a drill fixture and pop these holes in his manufacturing process. So that's a great example of how to use a planar point to solve for the center of that. So we're going to jump into an SAT file, and I'm going to show you guys how to do planar points. So come on in. Now you'll see in my SAT file I've tracked the perimeter geometry with a 2D freehand scan. But what I have to do is I've got to find the location of these 2 points here and this point up here as well. And my client's fine with that just being a single point. He can find out what size that is with some calipers or a gauge pin, but we need the center point tracked in there. And the way I'm going to do that is with a planar point. What the planar point does is when I bury the probe in here and I take that point will move, or the center point of the probe will go to whatever plane I tell it to go to. So let's do this first. I don't have a plane that is defining this top of the surface, so let's define that first. So I'll go to the plane and I'll just quick shoot a plane up there. And I'll just put a handful of points on there. And then I'll just call that the surface plane. And say OK to that. Now notice I've got the plane that shows up here on my SAT file. And I will escape out of that. Now, when I go to the Measure pull-down menu, and I go Point, and I go to Planar Point, notice what comes up here. I have to have a plane that's selected. Okay, well, I've got a plane out there that's known as that surface plane. And now I'll say OK to that. And I'm going to come into this little area here, so I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. Okay. And now notice, when I take my probe and I go inside of this first hole here, that 6 millimeter probe will bury into that chamfer, and it's not moving. I've got a perfect center location of that hole. Now, this is a good thing to note is when I go through and I set up for the measurement session, the first thing I look at is probe size. It's very important. In this case, when I did this 2D freehand scan, I love a bigger size probe so that I don't shank out as I'm working my way around the perimeter. And also, when I'm shooting this planar point, I knew I could get into that with a 6 millimeter probe and it wouldn't bury into the hole. I wouldn't have any slop at all. So that's perfect. That's exactly what I was expecting here. So I'm going to hit the front button. It's going to take one, and then I'm going to hit the back button for compensation. So what happened is it took the middle of the probe and it just moved it down to this plane right here. That was known as the surface plane. And then I'm going to give that point a name. I'll just call that the attach point 1 and say OK. Now, notice that CAM2 is expecting me to take another point on there. It's defaulting to that same planar point, so I do like that. So what I'll do is I'll just take that arm again, and I'll go into the second spot here. Notice my probe buries right into there. I'll take 1 point, then I'm going to compensate away. And I don't have to compensate in the hole. I don't have to compensate outside of it. Doesn't matter. It just takes the center of the probe and moves it to that plane. Now I'll put the arm down and say, okay, I'd like this to be called attach point 2. And say enter there. And then I'm going to just kind of pan up to the top here. Got one more point I need to put up there. And again, this plane was defined by all of these points that I took up here. So now what I'll do is I'll put the probe into that location there. One hit, and then compensate away. And then that will be my attach point 3. And I'll say OK to that. Now let me zoom out. I'll hit escape on this first just to back out of doing more planar points. And now notice I've got those 3 points that will show up in my SAT file in this model right here. So when I just that out, that center point location is going to be in a perfect spot for setting up a drill jig or some kind of a fixture, or even setting up an NC program that's going to come and it's going to drill in that exact location. So a planar point's a perfect example for how to shoot the center point of a hole. I don't use it so much for inspection. Inspection, I would probably shoot this and do a true position on these holes and measure those as a circle. But for reverse engineering, center point locations for holes, this works perfect for that.